Okay, so Dara, thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm writing a journalism article on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected local businesses in Bray, County Wicklow. And I wanted to talk to you today about your time working in the Old Anchor or the Anchor pub in Bray, County Wicklow. So, how long have you worked in the Anchor for?
I was working in the Anchor since May of last summer, and I've only just finished there now last week.
Okay, perfect. And what was your position in the Anchor? What job did you do?
I was a barman.
Okay, and so what kind of business is the Anchor then? What are the elements to the business?
Well, so for the last maybe 6 months or so, the Anchor have only done food. In the summer, uh, there was like our kitchen was outsourced to another business that used it, like a burger place, and we had some food stalls at the front. But the Anchor itself only does food. It used to have a kitchen, but as a result of the lockdowns, they ended up taking out the kitchen so they could sell it. They could outsource it to another business that could do deliveries and that sort of thing. And other than that, we just do drinks, any kind of drinks, pints, spirits, everything else. Like we take the orders. We the last while, of course, we've taken orders to the bar, and then most of the time would be orders taken on the floor and then dropped out to people sitting wherever they are.
Excellent. Okay, so would you be able to kind of talk me through what happened over the course of the pandemic regarding closure of the business? Because I know that nightclubs and bars were quite heavily restricted all through the pandemic, and Bray was no exception. So, do you know a rough timeline maybe of when you closed and what happened there?
Well, unfortunately, I wouldn't actually be able to give an entire timeline, seeing as I only started, like kind of more than midway through the pandemic, kind of when restrictions were starting to ease up a bit. I started like just in May of 2021, and I did start then when the pandemic was still, or when the lockdown was still in place, so there was no ceremony of alcohol, like a pub couldn't. But they kind of had a workaround to it for the last like 2 or 3 months before I'd started, and for about the first 3 or 4 weeks, where they had a thing called Beach Park, where they got a load of different food trucks and put them just outside in the sort of smoking area of the pub. So everyone was able to order food off them and then bring it outside. We weren't able to serve takeaway pints in Bray, but we had a small bar. So we weren't able to serve takeaway pints directly, but we had a small bar outside where we sold like sort of vodka slushies, vodka cokes, all of that sort of stuff. And we had a kind of small workaround where we poured draft beer into, well, we got a canning machine and like unsealed cans, and would pour draft beer into them, put them in the canning machine to seal them, and then sell them as sort of draft beer essentially in a can, because we weren't allowed to sell draft beer. It was the kind of best we could. Takeaway pints, it was the best we could do. Then after that, though, once it started, we had only, it was, there was no indoor dining, it was only outdoor seating, and everybody had to have a table and everything like that. It was only table service for about maybe 2 or 3 months during the summer. I can't remember the exact dates. And then, or maybe it was actually might have been, I'd say 2 months maybe. And then after that, people were allowed to sit inside again. And then it wasn't for another maybe 4 months, 3, 4 months after that again that we were able to take bar service. But this, I feel like it was kind of unofficially relaxed in terms of the actual restrictions. Like they weren't really enforced for the last couple months before bar service was officially allowed. So we would kind of allow some of it then.
Okay, and how did the pandemic and the way the business was during the pandemic, how did that affect the staff working at the business? Were there many of you who were off sick at a time? Was there short staffing? Did any of you get COVID on the job? What was that like? How did it affect you guys?
But I think the first thing that was most noticeable for me in the earlier stages when there was no indoor seating was, as a barman, it kind of like you were missing a good chunk of the job. Like talking to customers and interacting with them is like a large part of what makes a job enjoyable. So not being able to do that at all definitely kind of put a downer on it. And even once there was indoor seating, you were kind of in the environment, but you wouldn't be directly conversing with customers that much. Like you'd sometimes be dropping drinks and all that, but it wasn't really that much of a substitute for like people sitting up at the bar and constantly chatting while you're working. In relation to people getting COVID, we actually we like everyone was taking tests a lot, but it was almost a weirdly small amount of us got COVID. There was only maybe 2 or 3 times each time. Say one of the times when someone had it, when it was still kind of quite serious, the pub shut for 2 days while everyone took tests, but then everyone had to go get a PCR. When everybody else came back negative apart from the general manager, they reopened it a few days later, so that wasn't that big a deal. Although I do know that some of the other pubs around Bray, and like say someone's owned by the same people as the Anchor, some of them got really slammed by big outbreaks of COVID. The pub just across the road from me, or restaurant, Butler and Barry, at one point something like 12 of their staff had COVID, so then we from the Anchor, some of our staff had to go over to them, which left us understaffed as well. So yeah, it definitely did cause a bit of a mess. And there was also just the kind of like this sort of stress factor of like, if someone was ever close contact or anything else, is the whole thing going to be shut down? Is what's going to happen? Also, in terms of working there, I think one of the biggest effects on staff was that the pandemic overall has massively reduced the amount of people going to pubs and going out. Even now, say now that every, like, for all intents and purposes, like, we're completely open, the levels of business still have not returned anywhere near that of pre-COVID levels. So the fact of just having more quiet days and more days where there's not really much to do definitely kind of has an effect on general staff morale and just the enjoyment of the job, because it's just could be more boring when there's not much to do. The Anchor in particular dropped off a cliff in the last few months, and like you'd be doing nothing so often that the vast majority of staff left. And that was also actually a good chunk of the reason why I left as well. Just the business had started kind of like it had just been going downhill since the pandemic, and then especially since after the summer, and it just got too quiet that I wasn't really bothered to stick around while we were going to be doing feck all and everything else. And it's now actually it's closed for the next 2 or 3 months while they completely renovate and rebrand it now. Also, a kind of like more minor sort of effect of it, but still kind of a quite annoying one when you're dealing with it every day, was the fact that masks, when you're wearing them in a like loud environment like a pub and you're being given orders from floor staff, it would often cause, like, just the sound could be slightly muffled. So often it's like you don't hear people properly. When masks were being worn, there was a lot more just miscommunication, because you're often just like shouting something out, you're just yelling it quickly and you're hearing it and you got to get straight on it. Like, you don't really often have that much time to kind of perfectly clarify what people are saying. So if there's anything causing miscommunication, it will have knock-on effects. But that was more just an annoyance than anything else, rather than a serious issue.
That's interesting, because I was actually just going to ask a follow-up question about, have you noticed kind of a change now in overall kind of customers and the atmosphere in the Anchor since kind of restrictions have been lifted and stuff? But if you're already saying that like has already happened, do you think that that's kind of a universal experience for pubs and kind of bars and stuff in Bray in general, would you think? Or do you think it's just kind of the Anchor that's kind of going through that? And why exactly do you think that is, from like the customer's perspective? Why do you think there aren't as many people in the pubs after the pandemic?
So I don't actually think it is specifically just the anchor. I mean, the anchor, even completely regardless of anything to do with COVID, was kind of not being looked after enough and everything else. It wasn't being run well enough, so it was already on a downward trend. But across the board, even I'm working even in the Martello now, a different pub, which is kind of one of the busiest pubs in Bray, the busiest place in Bray, and even being there as a customer and everything else, it's nowhere near the levels of it's nowhere near pre-pandemic levels. As to why, I think it's a lot harder of a question to answer, because most people that would drink a lot in pubs and that would go out, I think would still go out. I think there is absolutely a portion of people that would have just been really scared by the pandemic and don't like being around, but I think that's a small enough proportion that it wouldn't actually have a very noticeable effect. Then there would also be a chunk of people that I guess would have gotten used to drinking at home that just prefer it to going out to pubs as well. People, like, it's a lot cheaper to have things in your house. A lot of people, like, there was a good chunk of people that invested in having sort of home bars and that sort of thing, or that have friends that have home bars, that often some of them maybe would go to those instead. I think another possible effect of it that I've thought is a possible reason for it is that, say, when the vast majority of people, when you're sort of around 17, 18, whatever else, like, you kind of get into a thing of drinking and everything else. A lot of, say, 16, 17, 18-year-olds wouldn't have had that. Like, as soon as we turned 18, would be going straight, oh, you're turning 18 now, so you start going to the pub. People who had just turned 18 wouldn't have had that same experience. So I think this is a kind of a guess, but I think there's definitely potential for the fact that the younger sort of age group wouldn't have got into drinking, going out as heavily, which definitely would have a knock-on effect, because that's often one of the largest customer bases in pubs. So, I mean, in general, it'd probably end up a good thing for, like, having less drinking in Ireland, but it still does have a knock-on effect of the businesses of pubs, definitely.
Interesting. Okay, so my last question for you then is just kind of in general, because, like, you're working in the Martello now and you were in the Anchor before, like, do you think that Bray and, Bray's tourism, a lot of people come to Bray to go to kind of the seafront and, go to the pubs and things like that. Do you think Bray and people coming to Bray to go to those pubs and stuff was really badly affected? So not just, like, the locals that go to the pubs, but, like, people that will kind of come to Bray to go out and socialise, like people from Dublin and stuff. Do you think that was overall affected because of COVID and the pandemic? And do you think businesses are doing anything to kind of come back from this? So Martello, Anchor, are either of them kind of making any changes to kind of come back from how hard they've been hit by the pandemic?
So in relation to the, like, kind of, like, because, yeah, you do get a lot of people coming from town and things like that, like, down to Bray on day trips. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it still seems quite, that still seems to be fairly strong. I mean, anytime there's a sunny day, especially last summer, constantly, like, a lot of the people that would be in wouldn't actually be from Bray. And even now, like, once the sun's kind of coming out a bit more, any day that's, like, real sunny, you get a lot of people coming in from town and other parts. So there is still, I don't think that would have been that much affected. But in relation to, like, what pubs are doing, I don't really think they're specifically doing anything as such, because of the fact that there's a lot of different factors to it and it's very hard to pin down. I think part of it as well, it wouldn't be unfair to assume that it's just going to be a gradual process of building back up, that it will just naturally get itself up on its feet, that there's not really some, like, problem that needs to be solved as before it. But Also, I think it like from other people working in pubs I've talked to and other sort of like pub managers and things like that, like because it's a kind of quite universal problem. Like almost anyone will kind of agree, apart from like very small places that are easier to fill, the business just isn't at that level that it was before. Because it's a universal issue that kind of affects them all, it's quite hard to kind of deal with an issue like that because it's much more societal rather than linked towards any specific pub. So there's not much that like any specific pub can do to actually change that, other than the usual measures that would be going to just get more business in general, but nothing like tailor made to that, I don't think.
Perfect. Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I really appreciate it. Some really interesting stuff there. Yeah, thank you very much.